This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. I'm here with my co-host Dara. How are you doing, Dara?
Very good, very good. I was out at the CWU rally today, which had about 15,000 postal workers that were striking back against poor conditions and pay claims going back a couple of months. And I think it's really, the Tories aren't backing down at all. But I think the show of strength today was a real boost to that struggle, and one that I think should be escalated and joined by other workers in the coming days.
Yeah, obviously I was working, so I couldn't actually come, but it looked amazing. And the pictures, like seeing all of these postal workers, first of all, coming like in coaches from all around the country, and then like over 17,000 of them being on the street in London, like seeing the picture of the demo is so impressive. And I think, Britain right now is a really kind of exciting point, and it's really exciting to be here, but also it's really exciting to see, all of these mainstream media, even like the most right-wing media, publishing these calendars that are showing who's striking on which day this month, because there's just so many strikes that people can't keep track of them. And what I found particularly amazing about it is that people are genuinely excited about them. I haven't heard any complaints about, the services are running slow or anything like that. It's support, which is really incredible. But this is definitely connected to what we're going to talk about today, but we're going to talk about a bit more kind of generally about the state of the economy, which I know I always love these episodes because I always sit here and nod because I learn so much from them. So it's going to be really interesting, I'm sure. And, everyone's feeling this right now. We've got soaring inflation, we've got crashing cryptocurrencies, stagnant growth. Everywhere, no matter where we look, there's like economic alarm bells are ringing like as loudly as possible. And obviously that's all happening with the backdrop of the war in Ukraine that's continuing to disrupt the global supply chains. And then you've got China's economy that's got another COVID wave, so it's completely stalled. And then there's also the protests going on and the debt crisis that exists over, that kind of looms over so many countries around the world. But at the same time, we're seeing so many corporations and, I think the thing that's striking the most for ordinary people who can't afford to heat their houses is the energy companies that are making record profits in a system where we're suffering, and especially in the colder countries right now, winter's kicked in massively. I'm sitting here and I had to turn off my radiator because it's too loud and I am physically freezing. So when you're seeing that, and while you're seeing that because you can't afford to heat your house, these energy companies are making these extortionate profits is really glaring, I think, for working class people around the world. And with, a recession that's coming very, very closely, if not already started, we're seeing that even the most vocal defenders of capitalism have an increasingly grim outlook on the situation. So I think it's important for us as humans, and especially as socialists, to understand, first of all, how bad things are going to get, and also why. Like, what's the root of this crisis? And I think most significantly, what type of program should socialists and workers adopt in order to fight back against this, to struggle for an economy that's run in our interest and not in the interest of these big energy companies and not the billionaire class. So to answer these questions and more, we've got Eric here today from the Belgian section of International Socialist Alternative. How are you doing, Eric?
I'm okay.
That's great. So can you tell us what's been going on in Belgium? Obviously, it's very exciting there right now as well. What have you been up to?
It's been very interesting to hear Dara report on the CWU meeting or demo he was on, because actually this is something happening in many countries at this stage. And of course in Europe it's under the form of strikes taking place, demos taking place. We've got 2 general strikes behind us in Belgium. And we've got a whole series of sectors where there are specific problems, like in the public sector. It's nearly in all aspects of it that you see strikes developing. We had the federal functionaries who were in the streets last week several times. You had the regional ones who were in the streets. You had some work interruptions by teachers and so on. It's really building up. And next week on the 16th, we'll have a new massive mobilization by the unions for it. There are complaints in Belgium, of course, and not that people are saying that they oppose the strikes. That's not the case at all. But there are complaints in the fact that actually the kind of demands that the trade union leadership is putting forward, trying to come to a deal with the government and try to be reasonable, is not at all corresponding with the type of anger we are confronted with at this stage. And as you say, for example, the main petrol company producer in Belgium is Total Final. They made a record profit of 6 billion euros only in the first semester. And if you compare them, there is talk about a windfall tax by the government, but they are talking about something like 300 million euros maximum. And even that is a debate within the government to be able to pass it through. So you see those contradictions that are developing not only in Britain, but you see it also in the mainland in Europe. Of course, in Belgium we have more of a tradition of general strikes for certain than in Britain. But in France you had those very important strike in the refineries, and there was a very radical strike with the government threatening to try to force the workers to go back to work, and that again leading to a broadening out of the strike also to other sectors. So that is music of the future we are confronted with, and in that sense what we will discuss today is more like the background, the economical situation, the material conditions that force people into action and which are of course the driver behind it. But you see a development now of anger and an urge to get a good type of organization, get strong, democratic, rank and file based trade unionism. That, to my opinion, is a characteristic which you see in Britain also, where some of the unions take a bit more initiative, some more left-wing leaders or some leaders who at least have a bit more of a hearing of the rank and file that are beginning to be profiled. These are elements that you see returning in different countries and that are today a big question which is very important to deal with. So my last weeks were a bit plenty with all those things, you know.
That's great, Eric. We know that this episode then all those experiences will be brought into that. And yeah, you mentioned, I think, very important point about, well, you touched on it. What were some of the material conditions? What are the key processes that are driving people into action? And of course, if we want to talk about that, it's inflation, cost of living crisis. The IMF put global inflation for 2022 at 8.8%. Now that's lower in some places, but you go to somewhere like Argentina and I think it's going to clock in at 100%. But in general, I wanted to ask you, why are prices surging by so much? And can you give us a little bit of an insight into maybe the more immediate background to that?
Well, before going into that, I would like to say that the European Trade Union Confederation, they calculated that for low-paid workers, the energy bills today are higher than a month's wage. And that is quite dramatic for many people. And it's in some countries even more. Germany is especially heavily touched now. It's in Belgium. It's everywhere. And as you say, in countries like Argentina or Lebanon or whatsoever, we are talking about completely different figures. But even there, if you look at the general inflation figure, what is striking is that exactly those commodities which working class families need and which are the most important in their expenses, food, electricity and gas, The elements of housing, because I read a report that the average mortgage repayment in the US was in October this year 77% higher than a year earlier. These are the situation, that's mortgage repayment. Imagine what it means for people who have to rent a home. So that's the enormous contradictions that is accumulating. And then your question on where do those price hikes come from? I will touch on the main issue, but I first want to quote one of those billionaires, they are quoted a lot, over what he thinks, because he points to a more underlying factor that will gain importance for as far as it's not overtaken by a further escalation of the war or a new climate catastrophe, which actually we can be already sure that will be part of the future. But he says, my recession thesis is the basic belief that we've borrowed from the future and we are going into a period of time where that borrowing has to be given back. And that's, to my opinion, a very strong underlying factor that he quotes. But at this stage, it's more like Yara was already touching on the supply chain disruptions, which are the dominant case for the actual inflation we are confronted with. Until a year ago, they were telling us that was temporary or that was transitory. They thought it's because of the pandemic and it will go over. But actually, these supply chain disruptions also reflect a more deeper problem that is present today. Over the past decades, you had an enormous integration of the economies internationally. That requires a certain stability in the international relations. But this is gone with the new Cold War, and that's even aggravated with the war in the Ukraine. And there's nothing that indicates that these tensions in the following period could be scaling down. On the contrary, we are confronted with, and that's maybe all those terms, I don't know if we'll have the time to go into it, deglobalization, the opposite of the integration, a disintegration, decoupling, economies that are split up, reshoring, certain production that is brought back to the country where the main production is taking place, or nearshoring, bringing it closer, or even friendshoring, going from countries which today are considered as a competitor to countries which are considered as more inclined to serve the interest of the main imperialist powers. All those elements are present. And if that is going on, with this whole idea of just-in-time production, meaning no stocks, no expenses for storage or whatsoever, which in the past was such a stimulating factor for the economy, but today it means that when there is an interruption in the supply line, there is simply no stock to kind of fill in the gap. And that's the kind of elements we are confronted with. So today, the main reason for the actual inflation, the main reason, the immediate reason, is the enormous gap between supply and demand as a driver for inflation.
I think this is really interesting about kind of inflation right now, But I was wondering, because inflation is something that we hear about all the time, constantly. It's like a term that's thrown out all the time, whether it's understood or not. And I was wondering if you can explain to us, not just about what causes inflation right now, but what are the roots of this kind of phenomenon in the first place?
Well, of course, we develop ideas, we try to have a global overview. We see the economy as a global interplay of contradictory forces. That's not the way that the main economic schools of capitalism look at it. they usually pick out one element, and then on the basis of that, they're gonna try to explain the full process from that element or from a few elements. And if you look at the policy that today the main central bank, the US central bank, the Fed, is proposing at this stage, is that they believe that if you restrict the money supply by hiking the interest rates, that will be sufficient to reduce households and business demand and bring it in line with the supply. But if you do that, if you do increase the cost of borrowing money, it also has an effect on the supply side. It risks to topple over the economy. It actually reminds to a policy that was applied also in the early 80s by the then chairman of the Fed, who was called Paul Volcker. And he, in 3 years' time, he increased the real interest rate from negative to 5%. It meant that inflation went down from 13% to 3% in those same 3 years, but it also meant that unemployment during that same period doubled to 10%. And when he was asked whether his policy would work, Volcker replied, yes, through bankruptcies. That's the kind of things that the Fed has in mind when they say that to bring supply and demand in equilibrium, a good recession can do the work. Now Marx, he says, contrary to that school, that it is actually not the money supply that drives the prices, but that it's the prices that determine the money supply. And he explains why. It is, he says, because money represents the amount of labor required to produce goods and services. So if you simply bring more money in circulation, the only effect it will have is to devalue the amount of labor that money represents. It won't fundamentally change anything. And then the other school, the Keynesian school, they are basically saying that inflation is driven by the wages, meaning that low unemployment is actually stimulating workers to demand more wages, and that is the reason for inflation. Marx was also confronted with that question, and he pointed to the fact, and we can see that today very easily, that actually if workers demand wage rises, it's usually a reaction to a process that is already going on, because they have become more productive, or as today, because the prices have gone up. So it's more a reaction to an earlier process than actually the key point that leads in it. And if we then look at the figures, because we can always have an idea of that, and today there are figures by the International Labour Organization that calculated that globally the real wage of workers has not gone up, it's gone down by 0.9%. But if you then look to the G20, there it has gone down by 2.2%. And if you want to look at the champions within that, Canada and the US, their wages have gone down by 3.2%. So it's simply wrong to suggest that it's the wages which are driving inflation at this stage. And then the question of unemployment, because they say that the labor market in the US is tight. There were many jobs liquidated during the pandemic. There are many people who take care today for people who are still ill or people who are themselves still ill. And there are many who went on retirement. In reality today, the number of people employed is still 3.5 million below what it was before the pandemic. That's the situation. Now, if we then come to what does Marx then single out as the reason for inflation? Well, he says it's an interplay of contradictory forces. It's basically, normally, an increasing productivity would keep prices low because they tend actually to reduce the amount of labor necessary to produce prices. That's the point. But we have been confronted with a situation where, in general, in real production, we are now on a low level of the amount of profit made per unity invested. And so many capital owners have shifted from real production to financialization. And that then has been amplified by the Cold War, has been amplified by decoupling and deglobalization, has been amplified by democratic shifts, has been amplified by climate disruption, by the fact that today wealth is concentrated in fewer hands, and that so if there are many poor people and they get a bit more money, they have to spend it, they can't just save it or anything. So that means these are all factors that level in together with this enormous borrowing or debt mountain that we are confronted with, which explain that today the underlying driver in the whole economy is towards more inflation. That's the situation that we are confronted with. It's not just, you can't just answer it by simply money supply or by simply wages. It's a complete combination of factors that come together.
So Eric, you've given a really useful outline there of understanding the current crisis, and I think it's fair to say everywhere you look there are economic storm clouds that are gathering. Yara mentioned alarm bells ringing everywhere you look, but I wanted to ask you, can you go into a bit more detail on what some of these red flags or alarm bells that are pointing towards another recession or a downturn?
Well, you're referring to this storm clouds. It's actually the same terminology that was used by the CEO from JP Morgan. And he named them. He said it's rates, he means interest rates that are increasing. It's quantitative, not easing, but this time tightening. It's oil, it's the Ukraine, it's China. He's stopping there. We could have put the climate also, and it will definitely be a very expensive situation. Already this year has been spent 250 billion only because of climate disasters. And you still have to, you only have to look at what is the result afterwards, and you see that the expenses have been really minimal in terms of reconstruction and so on. I think everybody knows that at this stage, but it's everywhere. Every economist you see now, I have this Mohamed El-Erian, he says there isn't enough evidence to assume that a coming downturn will be shallow or short. There is the inevitable Larry Summers, he says that the Fed over-tightening the economy into a severe recession, that's what he thinks will happen, and the unemployment will spike to 6%. And there are a lot that you could actually quote, but of course Nouriel Roubini, when there is a crisis coming up, he's always there. And he says the predictions of a mild recession, he says, are delusional. And I think he's right. And he starts to explain it. He refers to the explosion of budget deficits. That's in every country. He points to the enormous borrowing and leverage that went on for decades. And he gives the figures. He says global private and public debt as a share of world GDP rose from 200% of GDP in 1999 to 350% in 2021, and is now, a year later, at 420% in the advanced capitalist countries and 330% in China. In the US, it's higher than at the time of the Great Depression of 29-33. that says something. And he says it touches everyone, because for decades households were told, no problem, spend your future wage. You can't spend it? Give us your future wage. Corporate and high income taxes were cut. And the spending at the same time had to be increased because there were many social problems that were involved. And there were also, of course, all kinds of initiatives which have less of a social use, but which costed enormous money. And actually what you get is that in this long period, you had ultra loose money supply, and that favored debt over savings, debt over equity. That was the situation that we were confronted with over that period. But that means that all the borrowers, the households, the corporations, the banks, the shadow banks, the governments, and even entire countries have become what in economic terms are called, and I know that some will know that more from the films, zombies. Meaning households and corporates which are only kept alive, or countries which are only kept alive by zero or negative interest rates policies, by quantitative easing, and even by fiscal bailouts. That's the reality we are confronted with. And they will be faced with eroding incomes. They will be faced with sharply rising borrowing costs as the interest rates go up. They will have falling revenues. They will have value declining. And that, he says, Nouriel Roubini, all simultaneously. Now, during the Great Recession, meaning 2008-9, the G20 was still able to face that a bit off by a concerted policy and by the fact that China at that time was able to launch an enormous stimulus plan. Today, a concerted effort from all the main countries with the actual tensions between them, that's practically excluded. And today, China's model is completely broken in its housing crisis. So what we will have today, if there is simply a bailing out, or if the authorities intervene, it will only further stimulate inflation. That means we are going for a hard landing. And Roubini says a deep and protracted recession in which the economic crisis and financial crash will feed each other. And he calls it the mother of all stagflationary crises. Now, that sounds big, that sounds alarmist, but I really think that the kind of contradictions that are inbuilt in the system today do contain this danger as a real reality, and it's very difficult how that could at this stage be avoided on the basis of the recipes of the capitalists.
You know, I think that's really interesting because it's kind of like, since I was born, since I was conscious, I guess, I don't really remember a time where things went smoothly. And, you know, in the last few years, we've had, first of all, people blamed it on, you know, stupid leaders or bad policies or something like that. And that's why we've had a bad economy. Then, obviously, it was COVID that caused the bad economy, that caused the crisis. Then it's the war in Ukraine. It seems like there's always some kind of excuse that is like, you know, someone's pointing at that and being like, that's the problem. Look at that. But like you said, there's inherent kind of contradictions in capitalism that lead to it. And I think it's very clear when you see so many crises, one after the other, that's not that, and they're not just consecutive. You see them kind of working in a gradual way, making things worse and worse and worse for people. So I was wondering, what is this issue? Like, why do we see these crises continuously recurring and growing exponentially?
Well, I can understand, Yara, you're a bit younger than I am, that generation only knew crisis, but actually even me, I would have to go back to the post-war boom immediately after the Second World War, And it's true, my parents can tell about that. At that time, the generation after generation seemed to have a better life. But that's a long time ago, for that I have to go back a very long time. It was an exceptional period. It's the period of the welfare state. There was at that time in the world two main systems. There was on the one hand the Stalinist bloc, and on the other hand the imperialist bloc led by US imperialism, which had to make concessions because there was an alternative system that was possible, even if it wasn't that attractive. And that was a major issue. And at that time, the economy actually delivered. In the 70s, global productivity growth globally was yearly 3.2%. But that came to an end actually already in the early 70s. You know about the oil crisis, I suppose, with the creation of OPEC. They are a bit in the news today also. At that time, it wasn't in the Ukraine, but we had the Vietnam War, which went on for a decade, which was enormous expenses. You had the colonial revolution at that time, which was present, and you actually bit by bit had a situation of a classical crisis of overproduction, and of course, as I already explained, a lack of profitability, because of course with the economy becoming more complicated, the investments required to introduce a new system. A car factory today, it's running for 4 years and then the model has to disappear and there's another one. So these are enormous investments. It's not the kind of investment you can do on the basis of savings you have done. That's what the economy today and its key factors in the crucial elements is demanding. And that's reducing the amount of profit you can make on the basis of your immediate production, at least per quantity that you invest. And the reaction has been, financialization and desperate attempts by capitalists for decades to try to restore the rate of profit. That has been the key element for their policy. And they have tested it out in Chile with Pinochet. Then with Thatcher in Britain, you can talk about that. With Reagan in the US, they have actually gradually grappled towards what later on became known as neoliberalism, meaning deregulate the labor market, privatize, liberalize. We know all those words that today are identified with neoliberal policies, which are not new things, but which at that time were like a massive line, and every government had to apply it. Even those who didn't want to apply it, they were forced into it. But today, we are confronted with a situation where these neoliberal recipes, they just don't function anymore. And that was already clear in 2008-9. But at that time, they still held on to it to a certain extent. Remember the crisis in Greece, where the economy collapsed by 25%, but nevertheless in the European Union, they were standing on their point, no question of giving in to it. The workers in Greece had to pay for it. That's the kind of reaction you had. But then came the pandemic, and it became completely untenable. And that's the situation that we are confronted with now, is they have to change policy. They know what doesn't work anymore, but they still don't know what is going to work in the future, if there is a policy that really could work. But it is as we had it in the period during neoliberalism. They start something, they try to trial and error to go forward, and indeed, after a while, they did succeed to a certain extent to restore the profit rate for a period on the basis of what? On the basis of an extreme exploitation of labor. People became flexible, lower wages and so on, and no protection at work anymore. And on the basis of the fact that with the collapse of Stalinism, they got a whole region with educated people who were suddenly open for exploitation by the capitalists. they had a golden age, but then a very short age before the crisis came back. But on the basis of that, for a while, the illusion was there. We go for a unipolar world. Everybody will become better. But that was smashed with the crisis in 2008-9 and is then actually only become worse. And today they are back into the situation, but with lesser means to react on it.
Yeah, well, I think one key aspect of, the state of the global economy today that would be seen as part of this storm cloud that we spoke about earlier was a lot of the stock market volatility. Companies like FTX suddenly gone bankrupt, and a whole era of easy credit that Eric was talking about before, but actually particularly in 2020 with the pandemic and the unprecedented injection and easy money. You saw the development of huge speculative bubbles. Some now have called this the everything bubble. So it's speculative bubbles in housing and equities, other type of financial instruments. What does the volatility now in these markets say about the state of the global economy?
Well, there you are going really to the heart of the matter, in the sense that this easy money has accumulated enormous problems which the capitalists are confronted with. You refer to the FTX and Bitcoin, that's what you were referring to. I have here a quotation of the former boss of Goldman Sachs, and he says over Bitcoin, "I just thank God that the government never endorsed this crap." And then he joins in with Warren Buffett and so on, who said that Bitcoin is toxic and worthless. But that's the reality of the situation we are confronted with. And actually, to give you another idea, there is McKinsey, they made a study, and they came to the conclusion that less than a third of the net growth since the beginning of this century, since the beginning of 2000, was based on new investment. Only 1/3. And nearly 3/4 of the growth has been driven by making highly leveraged fictitious capital out of speculative activity. That's the situation you are confronted with. I do remember a conflict in a pharmaceutical company in Belgium. And it was a conflict over a premium at the end of the year. And the workers didn't agree with the proposal of the boss, and they threatened at a certain stage to block the blockbuster factory, this part of the factory, which was producing the blockbuster medication. They threatened to block it. And they only had to go there. And immediately the whole management came. And within an hour time, they got all their demands which were agreed, the workers. That was because if they blocked that, per day, the company was losing 120 million euros per day. But if that is then extrapolated towards the market value of the company, this 120 million euros on the market translates into 10 times, sometimes even 100 times that value, meaning it would be billions that would have been lost. But that says it all. Since 2011, in a selection of 10 countries, the value of the corporate assets have been growing by 61% relative to GDP. But the value that is supposed to underpin them, the corporate profits out of the immediate production, they declined by 1%. Meaning you have an enormous speculative bubble, an empty head on top of the real production. And as a result, what is the conclusion of McKinsey? They say there is a potential financial and property meltdown. That's the situation. Now, how did the governments react onto that and the central banks? Well, Normally, in normal times, the US central bank has a portfolio, has a balance, which is equivalent to 6% of its GDP. But in the crisis of 2008-9, it was increased to 20%. And today, the balance of the Fed is 40% of GDP. And that's not exceptional. The balance of the People's Bank of China is also 40%. The one of the ECB is 60%, and the one of the Bank of Japan is 130%. But this is enormous amount of fictitious capital created, money pushed in the economy, that of course is absorbed by the stock markets, but it creates the danger that whenever you have a certain growth in the economy, the moment you start to have growth, you are already talking about overheating the economy. That's the problem. What way you go, in each case, you are confronted with a major problem. You don't spend enough, you have a crisis. You spend too much, you have inflation that ends up in a crisis. That's the situation where capitalism at this stage is involved in. And what you were talking about, that has inflated all kinds of product, high yield corporate debt, meme stocks, cryptomania. You can imagine it. There are terms for everything that you can find out. And China is no exception. In China, it's actually, the stock markets are less important, but real estate plays the same role that in the West, the stock markets are playing. In China, real estates represent 27% of GDP, and they are fastly collapsing. Even today, I was reading an article in the French paper Le Monde that goes in this disastrous housing crisis which China is confronted with. Total debt for housing in China is twice the German GDP. That's what we are talking about. Bad debt as part of this debt is $223 billion. That's the situation that China is today confronted with. So no help from China to be expected, and actually no help in the West to be expected to try to deflate this enormous bubble in the economy, which is not just a bubble in the US or in the Western countries, but it's actually an international bubble that has been blown, and that's a real threat to the whole economic system.
You know, I think this whole conversation, I feel like maybe might sound a little bit contradictory to people, because we've been talking here a lot about how this kind of like era of easy, free, quick money is basically over. We've got all these central banks, you mentioned the Fed, are kind of increasing interest rates in a way that's like wreaking havoc on people's lives, and trying in an attempt to kind of tame this inflation, are basically causing so much stress for a lot of people. But then at the same time, there's so many governments who are helping people, and like it seems like state intervention is actually increasing in a lot of places. I know that in Britain, for example, the government is given some extra money to help to cover energy costs. But I know that around the world there's also that, but also helping in other areas as well. And obviously through COVID, we've seen the furlough schemes and all of this. So how can it be that the government is both helping with these kind of state interventionist actions, but also increasing the interest rates and basically taking away this the kind of money?
Because they have to, Yara. If they wouldn't, their whole system would implode. That's the logic in which they are driven. During the pandemic, in the advanced capitalist countries, it was about 16% of GDP that was injected in the economy either by fiscal or monetary stimulants. In total, it was like $16.5 trillion dollars pushed into the economy just simply to stop the system from collapsing. That was the situation. And they know that at one stage they gonna have to present this money, someone will have to pay up. And of course there are only two ways to make it pay up. Either you make your competitors pay, and they are very busy trying to do that. There is not only a Cold War, an economic war, a war over domination of the world between the two main imperialists, US and China. That's very clear. I think that the total export from China of IT to the US was divided by 3 over the past year. That's the situation. There is really a decoupling taking place. There is also the decoupling with Russia, of course. That's still of another level. But there are discussions today between the European Union and the US also over electric vehicles, protectionist measures, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and so on. You can't imagine it, or you find ways on how the different imperialist powers and the different capitalist governments are trying to shift the balance to someone else, let the others pay. And actually today the dollar is strong compared to most currencies. It's because actually the US has a currency which is still dominating on the international markets, in the exchange, in the currency reserves and so on, far more than the actual strength of the US economy. But that means also that a lot of capital owners, they are now trying to flee to what is the less unstable one. And that means that there is a capital drive into the US taking place at this stage, which is a disaster for many of the poorer countries who pay their wages in their local money, but then the goods they import are paid mostly in dollar, and the debts they have standing out are also in dollar, and it will mean that they will be incapable to pay them, and that leads to revolts, as we've seen in Sri Lanka, for example. But it's a more general aspect that we will be confronted with. And then, of course, ultimately, it's not just making the competitors pay, it's also making the workers pay. And in the poorer countries, that's quite brutal. In Lebanon, people are so desperate that they even rob a bank to get their saving money back. That's the kind of situation you have. And of course, in the countries where there's a bit more fat, where there's a bit more capacity to try to soften off the struggle, yes, you have interventions there trying to soften the enormous shock of the energy bills amongst the population. It is escalated. There is that institute, Bruegel. They regularly come out with figures, and they estimated that in total in the European countries about 700 billion euros was spent to shield consumers from the effect of the the enormous explosion of the energy bills. In Germany, it is equivalent to 7% of its GDP. In other countries, it's lower, and it takes the form of support to poorer households. They prefer selectively. It takes the form of a reduction on taxes on energy, for example in Belgium, but in other countries the tax until now on the energy bills was, the VAT was 21%, it's reduced to 6%, I believe in the UK it's 5%, if I'm not wrong. We should have a look at that. There is a form of subsidizing electricity production to keep actually the price lower than it would otherwise be. That's what's happening in the Spanish state and in Portugal. And then there are complete bailouts taking place from suppliers, or even strategic interventions in energy companies, like in France in EDF, where the government paid 8 billion euros to buy the 10% to buy the last 10% of the shares which were in private hands. Or for example, in Belgium, the main nuclear energy producer is using this situation to force the state to come into its asset holders, but it's with the idea that they will then also have to pay for the cleaning up of the whole situation, because all those nuclear power stations in Belgium, and that's on average, they were all built for 25 years, but they are now 50 years old. That's the situation we are confronted with. But that's the points that are going in. It has a certain effect, because if people get money in their pocket, and that reduces the immediate effect. It can also lead to the fact that maybe they hope, against better knowledge that things will improve and that at a certain stage those prices will go down. But it's very clear, now that the energy companies are used to get that money, even when the prices would go down, and that's not for the immediate, but even if the prices would go down, you don't throw that away anymore. You keep the prices at a higher level now that you know that people get used to having to pay that. That's the situation that we are confronted with. And in order to do that, if you want to make your competitors pay, you need nationalism, you need protectionism, you need coercion, you need threats, you need brutal force, you need militarism, and ultimately you end up in war. That's one thing. And if you want the workers, in the domestic field to pay for it, you need divide and rule, you need increased exploitation, but you need also oppression and repression and cancellation of democratic rights, so that you are prepared to go on the offensive and that you are ready at a stage. If you can divide the workers, then you're stronger in it. That's what explains this enormous reactionary trend we are confronted with, which is not only the far right and the extreme right, but is also the old center parties becoming much more aggressive in the policy they are putting forward. In Britain you have the absolute example with the Tories. In France, what Macron does, it's more it's more covered. He's got I don't know how you call that, but he does it a bit more with finesse, but in reality it's the same kind of policy. But also social democracy in Germany, even if there is a certain softening of those energy bills, even there the attacks are very strong, and that's the kind of situations that we will be confronted with in many countries.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think really the picture of capitalism is only going to get a lot worse, and but the other side of that, although that's quite a grim outlook, is that the inherent attacks on workers as well already, and this is how we started off the episode, is already spurring a response. I think you mentioned in terms of the debt crisis that this could give way to mass generalized revolts, but also we're also seeing that anger against the economic crisis play out through a number of industrial struggles that, yeah, as I said, we touched on at the start of the episode. So I think even it's quite clear, and I think what's really crucial about this episode of World to Win today is that if you look at these, what you've described, these economic processes, it's so clear that huge, major class confrontations are still to come. So with that in mind, what type of program can socialists bring into these struggles that will erupt, that point the way out of the crisis, but also point beyond the current system?
We have to recognize we come out of a period where there has been a certain loss of confidence that you are able to fight back. That's very clear. We have unions that have been weakened, union leadership that have not a program, left parties that are applying right-wing policies, or that at least are not capable of challenging at the level of, and reacting at the level of the challenge they are presented with. But then on the other hand, you do have the enormous anger that explode at times, and you can see that very quickly material conditions are pushing people into reacting, and we've seen a number of cases of that. I've quoted Lebanon, I've quoted Sri Lanka, but you have all those left-wing governments or more left-wing governments elected in Latin America, for example. You had those movements before 2019 and during 2019 and even during the pandemic, and then immediately straight after in Kazakhstan and so on. So you have struggle taking place. It's not that there is no willingness to struggle. There is, of course, a certain rebuilding of traditions that have been lost over the past periods, which we have to take in account, and there are specific issues because of the divide and rule policy applied by the ruling classes. It's elements that we definitely have to take up. Actually, the working class has the social force to become the leading force that pulls every layer in society with it and puts itself forward as a potential challenger for power, as a potential leader of all sections in the working class and around at that stage. But for that, we need democratic unions. The rank and file have to have its say. We need unions that are created for combat and not just for negotiations. We need to broaden and strengthen our struggle, and we definitely need also a program that takes up the immediate demands, that's for sure, but doesn't stop there. That also, and when you realize your immediate demands, you'll very quickly be confronted with it, how limited they are and how quickly they can be scaled back if you are not coupling it to more fundamental transitional demands that point to the necessity of transforming society. And I'll give you a few examples. We need an immediate hike of the low wages and of the benefits, so that benefits and low wages are in line with the real cost of living. These are very immediate demands. We need, in Belgium we still have it to a certain extent, even if it's eroded, but we need a sliding scale of wages. We need to compensate automatically workers in their wages for the increasing cost of living. Because we are not talking about 2% now, we are talking about 10, 15%, and in some countries 20, going up to 80 or 100%. That is the kind of situation you can't fight a war with guns by sword. You have to adapt your demands to the kind of questions you are confronted with. We should also have a much stronger policy on companies avoiding taxes or fraud. They should be immediately seized and put under public ownership. Remember, at the time of the pandemic, all those pharmaceutical companies making gigantic profits, these profits are gone. They have just pushed them. And we should have taken that in public ownership. And they have been profiting on the enormous disaster of the pandemic over the past period. We should, especially in some of the low-wage countries, we should say we have to abolish the offshore zones. We have to make sure that the interest on debts, that they are cancelled, that the repayments of debts are cancelled. These are basic elements. If you don't apply that, it's impossible to even start speaking about any solution for those. And then, of course, we have to whatever means that we do, whatever demands that we put forward, we also have to couple it to where do we get the means to apply them. And that's the question of the financial sector. When they were in difficulties in 2008-9, they didn't get the same recipe as we did. They got billions of euros to save them. They actually, part of the debts that the authorities still have in many countries are related to that period, not only to that, but also to that period. So we should take them into public ownership. We should unify them in one financial tool under democratic control in order to be able to do what is so urgent, meaning the creation of a job program for green jobs, but not with lower wages, with the same wages and with the same working conditions, because that's the basis on which we're going to win workers to the question of a green program. We should have a program of public investment in publicly owned, carbon neutral and quality social housing. Housing is a major problem in many countries at this stage. We should have a plan for public works to improve the infrastructure and reduce the waste that is being produced. And we should also create a free and high quality integrated public transport system. All the means to be able to do that are there. And all the concrete conditions which people are confronted with, look into the strikes we've been confronted with. You will hear railway workers explaining what could be done and what is only done. You will hear them tell them they are not capable even to take one day off because of the work pressure. All those elements, they are known. We know them. Put them together and we are confronted with. And we are actually making a real issue out of it. And that's the kind of type which we have to go for. But of course, we have to be very clear. Everything we can win under this system, they will always come back once the relation of forces have been turned over. And so to consolidate what we can win, we also have to pose the question of the change of the society itself. And that might be looking far away from some, but for many of the youth, it's not a question of looking far away. It's more a question of a need they are confronted with today, or it's this, or there is an enormous doomerism that they can't do anything in society. If we are capable to canalize the anger, if the unions take their responsibility there, if we can organize the rank and file and impose those elements, if we can work on that, that's the key issue that can bring us forward, and that can be a real resolve of this economic crisis, so that actually the wealth that is being produced by humanity is used also to bring forward humanity, and not just for the profit of a few, which we are confronted now with, and which leads to the kind of the stalemate that we are at this stage landed in.
Thanks very much, Eric. And I think, maybe I had a bit of doomerism when you were describing all of these economic storm clouds, but I think now we're providing a way forward, a strategy and a program, less so. And I hope workers, young people, people active in the trade union movement at the moment can, take something from this and understand the inbuilt contradictions of capitalism and link their struggle to other struggles and a fundamental transformation of society. So thanks very much, Eric, and look forward to having you on again. I'm sure we will need more frequent economic updates in the new year, when things are surely only gonna get worse.
Thank you, Dara, to have me, and thank you, Yara. It was very nice to be able to be here.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! solidarity.